education did you have as a young person? You grew up in what is now Leningrad, but then was St. Petersburg. Did you go to regular schools?
Well, I had a regular equivalent of what here is called a high school. It was a gymnasium in Russia. And graduated from the University of Leningrad.
What were your interests in those early years? Were they in literature, in writing?
I had decided that I would be a writer at the age of 9.
At 9?
At 9. And therefore that was my one overriding interest. But I didn't major in literature in university. I knew that I would learn nothing in school. So that...
You were determined, you knew that you would learn nothing.
Yes. From what I had gathered about the kind of literary courses that were being given. So I majored in history because I wanted to know the history of mankind as a sort of broad frame of reference for my novels, for my future novels.
Are there books or writers that influenced you in those formative years?
Only one. One philosopher and one writer. As far as writers go, Victor Hugo, whom I discovered at 13, and that was the greatest literary experience I ever had. Incomparable and incommunicable. I admired him enormously. The sense of lives that he communicated, the glamour, the grandeur of men, was so high above anything I had encountered in any other books, and certainly in another universe as compared to the reality of Soviet Russia, that I, to this day, owe an enormous debt of gratitude to Victor Hugo. And it's from him, in effect, that I learned the art of the romantic novel in the serious sense of the word, the integration of plot, of action, with the theme and the philosophical meaning of a book. I don't agree with his philosophy, but I admire him as a writer tremendously. The other influence is, of course, Aristotle in philosophy, who is the only philosopher with whom I agree, at least in fundamentals, not in everything, but in that which is originally his. Not in the Platonic element in him. And that had a great deal of influence on my subsequent thinking, but those are the only two.
Did you begin writing at the age of 9?
I began slightly earlier, at about 8 and a half. I remember the first story I wrote was signed. It was my name and 8 and a half after it. But...
was it fiction?
Fiction. It was a movie scenario. I was very impressed with screen, and I started writing screen stories. I attempted my first novel at the age of 16 in my first year in college and gave it up because it was just, I was growing too fast. It became dated by the time I was in my second year. So that I didn't start writing professionally until I was in this country.
When you began writing fiction, did you write within the framework of what you call romantic realism, the grandeur of man, what man could be?
Always.
Were you influenced at all by the Russian Revolution in this respect, and living in a Soviet society?
Not at all. Perhaps it might have helped me in the ideas I held long before, in realizing how evil the opposite of individualism
collectivism
really is. Yes. In grasping how bad collectivism is in concrete practice. That might have been a value, but it's a horrible kind of experience. And I would rather have arrived at the positive without encountering that negative, but I can proudly say it didn't affect me, it didn't change anything in my way of thinking, the kind of development I can now look back upon. I went to a Soviet university, which of course, apart from, there were still at that time some good professors who were actually teaching subjects, but there was also a great deal of propaganda, and it did not affect me in the least. For that, I'm very grateful to myself.
You came to America when you were about 20 or 21 years old.
That's right.
And you went to Hollywood. Was this because of your interest in screenwriting?
Yes, but not ultimately. I could barely speak English. I certainly couldn't write it. And it was, at that time, the day of silent movies. So I had figured out that I could be able to write a scenario, but not yet dialogue. That's why I decided I would start with the screen. But my first ambition always was novels.
You did earn your living in the early years in Hollywood in a variety of ways, I suppose.
Oh, I had a bad struggle, yes. I had to hold odd jobs and even wait on tables. And first day I tried it, I was fired right there. But the last job of that kind, I was there a whole week, so that I was learning. But it was the years of the Depression, you know, and it was very difficult. I held all kinds of jobs which were very, very boring, but I was able to write.
Was that good for one's character, to have to suffer that way, to work as hard as you worked?
No, I don't think so. I think the only good is later. It gives you a certain self-confidence if you can overcome it and rise above it. But as such, I don't think hardships are good for anyone.